In the name of God, in the previous session, we taught you two paragraphs of this part, but here I want to repeat the first and second paragraph of this part again. Okay, we discussed what is being classified in this chapter. We have now illustrated the basic means for describing grammatical structures across languages. All of the basic genitive types have been described, although there are variants that have not been illustrated. In addition, some of the more complex genitive types involving combinations of the basic strategies have been given to show that the typology must be extended beyond what we have provided here. But this will suffice to make two important refinements to the concept of typological classification. Typology, in the sense of cross-linguistic classification of types, is often considered to be a classification of whole languages into types, that is, a classification of language types. For example, MEM is an indexing genitive language type, Bulgarian is an adpositional genitive language type, and etc. The notion of a language type originates in the 19th century view of the morphological typology of languages. In the vast majority of cases, however, a classification of language types is difficult, if not impossible. Most languages have available several different structural types for a given construction, such as the genitive. For example, English has many different constructions, all of which are genitive constructions on the basis of our external definition that represents several different types and the combination of types. Okay, you should know that in the 19th century, the typology was considered as just the morphological typology. Here we can see the example of a genitive in English. We can express the genitive through the suppletion, like my house. The bold word are the genitive. Or through the linker, like apostrophe S, Jan's house. Through the adposition, the Library of Boston, of. Through the linker plus adposition, a book of Jan's, both of them. Through the suppletion and adposition, a book of mine. This is the mine is suppletion and of is adposition. Here in this example we can see we have 5 types of expressing the genitive in English. We want to understand that which one is basic and how we can typologies and we can classify the genitive form of English. Instead, we can say the particular genitive construction illustrated by the Library of Boston belongs to the adposition type. This is our first refinement of the notion of a type in typology. Okay, it is the first notion of type in typology. What we mean by type in typology? We mean a structural type is represented by a particular construction in a particular language. Okay, a structural type is represented by a particular construction in the particular language. We will call this a classification of linguistic types. A language may have more than one construction representing more than one linguistic type. This is our problem, and we had here that a language may have more than one construction representing more than one linguistic type. Technically, therefore, one cannot say that languages are of one type or another, or that languages use one strategy or another. This point is crucial in evaluating claims concerning object-verb languages or ergative languages. In most cases, such claims must be identified with the actual constructions in which object-verb, word order, or ergative morphology are used. Although it is impossible to say in general that a language belongs to a particular structural type, such as the adpositional genitive type, it is very often possible to determine which of the many structural types a language uses is the basic type. Okay, dear student, when we want to show the typology of one language, we should understand the basic type of that language. You know that we have so many structure in language, but which one is the basic? And based on the basic, which is the frequent one, we can consider the typology of that language. Therefore, here we want to find the basic type of each language to give it in one typology. A language basic type may be useful in making typological generalizations. Okay, as I told you, based on the basic type, we do the typological generalizations. For example, there has been a good deal of success in making typological generalization on basic word order types. Thus, there may be a legitimate sense in which we may be able to speak of language belonging to a language type as opposed to a construction belonging to a structural type. This raises the question of determining which of several structural types a language uses for a given function is the basic one. There are 4 criteria that can be used to identify a basic type. We will illustrate this criteria by establishing the basic word order of subject S, verb which is V, and object which is O in English clauses as SVO, as in the chicken cross the road. This is the basic word order in English, but here we can see that sometimes some structure like this following 4 structure are against this word order. The first, if the construction is restricted to a grammatical subclass, then it represents a less basic type. Dear student, here we show you 4 criteria in which we can find the basic type of that language. We told you that the basic type, the basic word order type in English is subject, verb, object. But sometimes we don't have such a structure. In which condition? One of them is here. If the construction is restricted to a grammatical subclass, then it represents a less basic type. For example, the English existential construction has verb subject word order. Dear student, when we have existential construction in English, its word order structure is in this way: verb subject. But we told you that the basic type is subject verb object, but here we have verb subject like in 41A, but it's found with only a subset of verb compared to 41B, hence is not a basic the SVO construction. So here we have there goes the ice cream truck. At first we have verb, then we have subject. It is against the English common and basic type word order, which is subject, verb, object. Here we have verb, subject. And again, there crashes the ice cream truck. Second, again we have another situation which is against the SVO structure. If the construction is pragmatically or semantically specialized. You should know this criteria, dear student, and you should summarize them without example. If the construction is pragmatically or semantically specialized, then it represents a less basic type. For example, the English existential construction is used to introduce new referent into a discourse. Likewise, the English typologization construction, which can has object, subject, verb order, which is against the English basic word order. In typologization, we have object, subject, verb order. Requires the special information status for the object. Philosophy, this is the object. I, subject. I have is verb. Always enjoyed. Here we have typicalization. It is because of the semantic or pragmatic reason. The third one is if the construction is structurally unusual. If the construction is structurally unusual, typically though not always more complex, then it represents a less basic type. For example, the English cleft construction, which can also have an object, subject, verb order, involves a complex structure with it, a form of be, and a relative clause, which is pragmatically specialized in this way. It's Hannah that Federico likes. Again, we have object, subject, verb. Finally, the less frequent construction is less basic. Again, here, based on the frequency, we explain this matter. The less frequent construction is the less basic. The basic subject, verb, object construction of English is much more frequent than the existential, typicalization, or cleft construction. Dreyer has proposed the heuristic that one construction must be at least twice as frequent as the alternative construction in order to be categorized as basic, assuming just two occurring types as verb-object versus the object-verb order. Lacking other more specific structural evidence, simple text frequency is used as an indicator of basicness. I want to repeat it again because it is important. Dear student, lacking other more specific structural evidence, simple text frequency is used as an indicator of basicness. The simple text frequency. For example, in Derbyshire and Plum survey of languages with object before subject, they frequently had to resort to this criterion. The frequency criterion may appear to be a last resort, but it is also universally applicable and remarkably reliable. A construction that is grammatically restricted or semantically or pragmatically specialized is almost certainly going to be less frequent. This is important. When they are less frequent, they are not basic. A construction that is grammatically restricted or semantically or pragmatically specialized is almost certainly going to be less frequent. And you know that when a structure is less frequent, that is not the basic form. Although there is no priori reason to expect structurally more complex constructions to be less frequent, in fact, they usually are, and this relationship is an important typological generalization. There are some exceptions to this latter generalization. However, for example, in modern American, the structurally simplest declarative construction, lacking an auxiliary, is semantically restricted to weak obligation or hortative function. So the hortative function, we give others advice, piece of advice. There is a historical explanation for this type of example. The simpler construction was used for the present tense and extended to other functions such as the subjunctive. As such, it was the most frequent construction. However, in modern American, it was then replaced by a more complex construction, a progressive with the auxiliary verb be for the most frequent function of present tense, and the simpler construction was restricted to a less frequent function. Of course, it may be that no one construction is the most basic in a language by this criteria. It may be that no one construction is the most basic in a language by this criteria. In such a case, one must simply describe the language as belonging to multiple types. Okay. Of course, it may be that no one construction is the most basic in a language by this criteria. In such a case, one must simply describe the language as belonging to multiple types, dear student. While this may appear to be a problem for typological classification, it turned out to be extremely useful for diachronic typological research because it often represents a language in transition from one type to another. Finally, it should be noted that the structural types themselves are morphosyntactically complex and subject to analysis. One can construct a typological classification of construction based on a subset of their structural properties, or even just one property, such as the relative order of genitive possessor, which is genitive, and possessive noun, which we show it by N in genitive construction. Linguistic types based on individual structural properties form the foundation of most typological analysis. Each structural property represents the independent variable on which cross-linguistic generalizations are based. This is not to say that a more holistic view of constructions may not reveal important typological generalizations that call for explanation. However, the analysis into structural features allows us to construct significant language universals, as will be seen in Chapter 3. For example, the separation of the structural feature of word order allows us to construct implicational universals such as subject, object, verb, word order implies genitive noun word order. If it turned out that within the possessive construction there is dependency between word order and the type of additional morpheme, such that there don't exist languages with genitive order and adjectival indexation, then we would be able to construct an implicational universal linking these two features. Adjectival indexation in possessive construction implies genitive noun word order. And if it turned out that a more holistic analysis of the construction were necessary, that is, that a combination of structural features plays a role in an implicational universal, then we would be able to construct this imaginary universal using a conjunction of the relevant structural feature. If the possessive construction is genitive noun with an indexation prefix indexing genitive, then through this we introduce the implicational universal. Thus, the structural analysis of types is essential to typological analysis. The necessity of the structural analysis of the types in order to a proper typology demonstrates the depth that typology, like other modern approaches to language, owes to be a structuralist approach to linguistic analysis. Okay, another part is about the morphological typology. You know that, as I told you, in the 19th century, we consider typology as the morphological one. Here you can see the different typology and different types of morphology based on different scholars. You should know this. For your summarization, you should mention these types, and for your final exam, you should know this morphological type. The first typological classification of languages, classification by structure rather than by genetic affiliation, was the so-called morphological typology. Although this typological classification has undergone many refinements, the basic description of language types developed in the 19th century are still widely used, and so it merits a brief discussion here. Also, morphological classification plays a significant role in a diachronic typology, in particular in process of grammaticalization. The original formulation divided languages into two types. Okay, they are important. The original formulation divided languages into two types, affixal and flectional. Affixal and flectional. There was the two classification of morphology. Schleicher was vague about the definition of these types, but the distinction may be characterized roughly as the simple combination of morpheme versus the phonological alternation of morphemes in combination. Schleicher's brother August added a third type, languages with no structure, no affixation or inflection, with classical Chinese being the paradigm example of the language with no structure. Humboldt added the fourth type, incorporating, to designate languages such as those of North America that treated the verb and the object as a single word. Okay, here we read four types of in morphology: affixal, inflectional, no structure, and incorporating. You should know them, which Schleicher and August and Humboldt introduced them. The classical formulation of the morphological classification by Schleicher distinguishes three types. This is very important, you should know that. Maybe I ask you about the Schleicher morphological classification, you should know that. Schleicher distinguished three types for morphological classification: isolating, agglutinative, and inflectional, which are, we consider them again, and we have such a classification? No. Schleicher distinguish three types of morphological classification: isolating, agglutinative, and inflectional. This is important, you should know that. Corresponding to August von Schlegel's new structure, affixal and inflectional respectively, which based on the Schleicher, isolating is equal to no structure. Agglutinative means those affixal, and inflectional means the inflectional languages. Under the classical formulation, isolating languages don't use affixes at all. You should know that. Dear student, here we give you the definition for these types. By isolating, we mean those languages which don't use affixes at all. They don't have any affix. By agglutinative, we mean those languages which use affixes that denote single grammatical categories, for example, number, and are concatenated with relatively little phonological alternation. And inflectional languages use affixes which often fuse together several grammatical categories such as number, gender, and case into a single morpheme, and which often undergo major phonological alternation when combined with roots. Dear student, here we have the definition of these types. You should know them. Maybe I give you the definition of one of them and I want you to find its type, or maybe I give you, for example, agglutinative, and I want you to find its definition. Therefore, you should know the definition of these types. The typological classification of languages at the time differs from the modern concept of typological classification in two main important respects. First, the classification recognized only a single parameter on which languages varied: the morphological structure of words. Second, it was conceived as a classification of languages as a whole, not parts of language. Both of these characteristics can be attributed to what is called the Humboldtian view of language. In this view, each human language has its organic unity which manifests an inner form. Greenberg in 1974 called this view that a language as a whole has an organic, even unique character, the individualizing approach to typological classification. The structuralist movement in linguistics altered the view of the morphological typology of languages. By postulating that a language constitutes a structural system, it made it possible to examine parts of language in isolating and to make a typological classification of various features of language. Thus, one may typologize different parts of language, and one may typologize languages in different ways, as we have done with the example of genitive constructions. Sapir's revision of morphological typology illustrates the possibility of typologically classifying languages in different ways. Sapir divided the morphological properties of the 19th century classification into two independent parameters: the number of morphemes per word and the degree of phonological alternation of morphemes in combination. Sapir distinguished three languages types in terms of number of morphemes. Okay, here we have another classification of word of morphology based on Sapir. You should know that. Sapir distinguished three language types in terms of the number of morphemes. One of them is analytic. In the analytic language, we have one morpheme per word. Synthetic, which a small number of morphemes are used for per word. and polysynthetic, a large number of morphemes, particularly multiple roots per word. He then distinguished 4 types in terms of the degree of alternation of morphemes: isolating, which they have no affixation at all; agglutinative, which is simple affixation; fusional, which considerable morphophonemic alternation; and symbolic, which is suppletive. Here we have 2 classification based on Sapir: analytic, synthetic, and polysynthetic, and isolating, agglutinative, fusional, and symbolic, which you should know the definition of each of them. Greenberg in 1954 takes the morphological typological classification one step further in developing the concept of a linguistic type. He observes that there are no clear boundaries between the analytic, synthetic, and polysynthetic types because the number of morphemes per word is a quantitative value that is for all practical purposes continuous. Greenberg constructs a quantitative index, morpheme per word, which one can measure using text counts. The significance of this representation of language types for typological classification is that languages or constructions need not be classified into discrete types, or to put it differently, languages can be ranked one some structural parameter relative to other languages. Greenberg also quantifies the degree of phonological alternation, that is, the degree of allomorphy, and a host of other structural parameters as follows. Okay, here we see that the Greenberg quantifies the degree of phonological alternation, that is, the degree of allomorphy, and a host of other structural parameters as follows. Number 1, we have morphemes word. The second, agglutination, morpheme juncture, root morphemes word, derivational morpheme word, inflectional morpheme word, prefixes word, suffixes word, ON, which is word order used to indicate grammatical relation, total grammatical relation, PIN, which is pure inflections used to indicate grammatical relation, total grammatical relations, CON, which is concordial inflections used for grammatical relation, total grammatical relation. The first 2 indices correspond to Sapir's 2 morphological parameters, and hence the original morphological classification. The next 5 indexes typologize words by the type of morpheme, root, derivational, inflectional, and by affix, position, prefix, or suffix. The last 3 indexes typologize grammatical relation taken in the broadest sense of any grammatical dependency, not just subject and object, by means of expression of the relation word ordered, pure inflections, not involving indexation like usually case affixes, or concordial inflections, which is indexation. Although the traditional morphological typology is generally applied to a language as a whole, it could just as easily be applied to different parts of the linguistic system. For instance, the nominal system of a language may be agglutinative, while the verbal system is inflectional. It means that in one language we can see 2 or 3 types of typological word order. For example, in one language, as we can hear, the nominal system of that language may be agglutinative, while the verbal system may be inflectional. We have 2 types of morphology in one language. Also, Greenberg's first 7 indices could be computed separately for word of different categories, so that, for example, one might discover that nouns in a single language, or perhaps in languages in general, are more likely to be suffixant than verbs. The current concept of a linguistic type is a characteristic of what Greenberg calls the generalizing approach to typological classification, that is, the classification of languages, or more precisely elements of a language, by structural features of maximal generality. The individualizing approach, taking to its extreme, defines languages by their individual and perhaps unique combination of grammatical features. The truth has to be somewhere in between, since languages are different structurally, though not so different as to be incommensurable. If language as a structure does hang together in a certain way, then identification of one structural feature, the feature defining the linguistic type, would imply the presence of certain other structural features. The generalizing approach to typological classification, with its emphasis on single morphosyntactic features rather than the language as a whole, is the primary contribution to modern typology. It does so by separating the typological classification of logically independent grammatical properties of languages from the discovery and explanation of relationship between features across languages. The latter is the topic of the next 5 chapters. Okay, dear student, chapter 3 is very important, and the core matters of typology will be discussed in this chapter: implicational, universal, and competing motivation, which are very important. They are of vital importance. I think for this session it is enough until this the first of chapter 3. Okay, in this session we told you about, dear student, the details and example, as I told you before, are not very important. For your summarization, you must just mention the important point, those matter which are bold in your booklet, and I explain them more. Therefore, there is a need to mention all of the details. You should delete the examples and the details for your summarization. You can summarize this session just in 2 pages, not more. And for the final exam, you should know the definition, the important term. Here, for example, in this session, we told you about the linguistic types, and we defined the basic type, which based on that basic type we can do the typology. And here we told you that sometimes some structure, sometimes in each language we can see some structure and we don't know that which one is basic. Here we told you 4 criteria, that in these 4 criteria we can see the basic type. For example, when we have the in English we have the existential construction, we can see the basic form of English, or when we have the construction which is pragmatically or semantically special, we can see the basic form because we change the order of sentences intentionally because we have another goal. Or sometimes when we have the unusual structure in language, sometimes and we told you that when the less frequent construction is the less basic. In these 4 criteria, based on these 4 criteria, we can't find the basic form in English, but in another condition we have the basic form. And here we give you example about the basic structure, and then as I told you, in the 19th century we consider typology just as the morphological typology, and in morphological typology we had different classification based on the different scholars. For example, Schleicher, August, and Humboldt, Schleicher, August, and Humboldt give this classification, that we have the affixal, inflectional, no structure, and incorporating languages. After them we had another classification that we had Greenberg make this types of morphological type word order, morphological classification, isolating, agglutinative, and inflectional. And here you can see in this paragraph their definition, which I told you that they are important. You should know the definition of them. And then we had another classification based on Sapir, which did two types of classification. One of them was analytic, synthetic, polysynthetic. Another one was isolating, agglutinative, fusional, and symbolic, which here you can see the definition of each one in this paragraph. And then I think the matter of this paragraph are not as important the previous paragraph, because here just give you the more information about the typology, the morphological typology. Dear student, please summarize this session. You can summarize it in maximum in 2 pages, and look at the video many times to get the point. If you had any question, you can ask me through the